to talk about. So student loans. So first off, before student loans, we had to talk about they basically swatted down affirmative action in colleges. And so this is going to be kind of a big issue. Let's watch this a little bit, and then let's get into why this is such a big issue. And maybe what we'll do is we'll have Michelle Sandlin, who's my mother, has worked in higher ed for 43 years, and she's pretty active in this, or was pretty active in this before she retired this year. And then she was recently in an article for NPR about this, and this is a lot of this is in her book. So hopefully we'll get an interview with her, and we'll add that this weekend if we get a chance. But let's go ahead and jump right into the affirmative action thing.
We begin tonight with the Supreme Court striking down affirmative action and reshaping college admissions. In a 6-3 decision, the justices ruled that Harvard University and the University of North Carolina violated the Constitution by considering race when deciding whether to admit someone to their school. A landmark case overturning nearly 50 years of precedent, the latest example of the conservative majority redefining American law, including abortion rights and guns. The ruling means higher education institutions will need to come up with new ways to create diverse student bodies. Groups of protesters, mostly made up of young adults, gathered outside the court to voice their outrage. And to underscore how monumental this case is, 6 of the 9 justices wrote opinions, many personal and strongly worded. CBS's Major Garrett has all the new details and will start us off tonight from outside the Supreme Court. Good evening, Major.
Good evening, Nora. Yes, it was personal, with justices on the touchstone issue of race talking to and past one another. This sweeping and historic ruling effectively ends affirmative action in college admissions, reversing decades of precedent that less conservative court majorities had protected and giving colleges and universities some latitude to consider race as one factor as they sought to build more diverse student bodies.
All right, so we'll jump into a couple things there. I think that guy's first name was Major. I think he should have joined the military and worked his way up to the rank of major just so he could have been called Major.
All right, fair enough.
Stupid jokes aside. All right. So here's the deal. We'll look at this article. So in affirmative action, I want everybody to understand, affirmative action could not give a mathematical advantage by race. Right.
When you say a mathematical advantage, what do you mean?
That means that just because you're black or Hispanic or whatever, it doesn't mean you could have a better mathematical advantage of getting into school than a white person. Right. Or an Asian person. What it did is if you guys were like fairly equal and it came down between the two of you, the preferential would go to the minority race. But it wouldn't give you any sort of advantage. Like if I were black and my scores were way lower than yours and you were white, they would take the white kid. They would have to. They couldn't just pick me because I'm black, and they wanted to balance it out.
So it really only becomes much of a factor if the two people applying have identical scores. Basically.
Yeah, hypothetically.
Basically end up being this, are essentially on paper the same candidate.
Right, but what ends up happening is when you do it that way, you started to see that more and more minorities were going to school, just drastically more. And I'll tell you what they did in California. They rolled back affirmative action back in the 90s, and within a year, the following year, the enrollment for African Americans dropped by 40% into these schools. And that's what it does, is it literally sets a bar where it's more difficult for black kids and Latino kids and Native American kids, etc. And what ends up happening is a lot of them, after they, that becomes the case, is they sort of just give up because their counselors would tell them there's no way you're getting into Berkeley. There's no way you're getting into UCLA. right? Because we come from a poor school, so it's not even worth trying. So
Right.
they literally give up. So they looked at this from Indiana college admissions on how they were impacted, and I just thought this was interesting. Um, so they're not clear how it'll affect everything. Blah blah blah. They go through some of the history with Lyndon B. Johnson. For universities, affirmative action has largely meant that race is one of the factors considered as part of a student's application, and the practice is part of the efforts to both grow and maintain a diverse student body. The impacts of this doctrine are nuanced. Schools are barred from instituting racial quotas or using formulas that give students a mathematical advantage, what I just said. That's how it was, right? Under these two cases that came through the Supreme Court recently, one against Harvard and one against the University of North Carolina, the school's affirmative action policies have discriminated against white and Asian American applicants by giving preference to Black, Hispanic, and Native American applicants. What's interesting about this is in the case, they brought up from the defense side, right, saying we want to keep affirmative action in place. They brought up the NAACP and all these student bodies that were Native American, African American. I mean, dozens and dozens of them spoke, right? They're saying from the plaintiff side, it's Asians and whites that are being discriminated against because of this policy. No Asian groups stood up. And I don't know that there were any white groups. So there was no students saying they were being harmed. Once again, on the case, right? So it's an odd ruling.
Well, we keep seeing that over and over again.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an instance where nobody was actually standing up saying, I've been harmed, that is theoretically in the harmed group, right? Like, none of them are self-identifying.
Right.
No groups are self-identifying. Likewise, we saw the same thing with Mohila. Like, the Mohila situation brought down the student loan forgiveness situation, but Mohila didn't say they were harmed either.
Yeah, we'll get to that one in just a minute,
So
too,
we're
but
seeing,
yeah.
I know, like previewing what we haven't talked about yet.
But
my point is that we're starting to see a pattern here where the Supreme Court no longer cares that the people are not saying they've been harmed. Somebody else is pointing out, oh, you got harmed. I don't get to go and maybe I get to sue people now. Who knows? But I don't get to go, bringing up legal cases saying Duncan got harmed, and so I want to bring a legal case up. Duncan's not complaining, but Duncan got harmed, and I now have an issue because Duncan got harmed, and so now I want to bring up this case because Duncan got harmed.
Right.
Meanwhile, Duncan's back there. He's just chilling, and he's like, I'm fine.
Oh, Duncan's not even there. Duncan's somewhere else.
Didn't show up
because he doesn't give a shit.
Duncan's off doing. Yeah, you don't care. You're off doing your thing. I'm the one that's going crazy because I think you got harmed, and you're like, I'm good. Whatever. I'm fine.
Meanwhile, Duncan's sipping Mai Tais somewhere. Nobody, it's just, it's just ridiculous. So here's, I want to talk about this. So don't tell me I lost it. Oh, here, Ginny Lee, okay, NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They supported Harvard. They were the defense, right? He had a good quote here, though. The whole notion of whether or not you can consider... this one. Gosh, this is just highlighting it. So this paragraph. This whole notion of whether you can consider race or should consider race in college admissions is really, in many ways, a perspective on our society and whether race matters or not, or whether it has an impact on people's lives. Do we ignore that and pretend that it doesn't exist, or do we tackle those racial inequalities and be race conscious so everyone is truly equal? Those are two very, very different perspectives on life on scenarios, society in the United States. I think she nailed that.
Yeah.
You can't. So to sit there like Robert says, well, you can factor. You can't factor their race in admissions, but if they're writing like their student essay and they talk about their experience because of their race, you can factor that, but you can't factor their race. But if you don't factor their race, you're not factoring them, the person, because their experience is different. I don't know what it's like to be
If you're
black.
going to evaluate somebody holistically, the
Right.
fact that I'm a woman, the fact that I'm bisexual factors in to my life experience and your ability to assess me as a holistic person. You can't say that you being male and Asian does not factor in to
Yeah.
your life experience and who you are. They're not in and of themselves the only factors, but it certainly has colored your experience.
Absolutely. And that's my point, is you can't sit there and say, well, just ignore that portion of it.
Right.
Which is kind of what they're saying. And they've rendered it to the point where it's almost meaningless. So, grant colleges will use holistic and stuff still, but and holistic is a good thing. But the bottom line is it doesn't really solve the issue. And when you're talking especially about the bigger schools like Harvard or UCLA, or especially the Ivy League schools and stuff, they're not going to be able to follow through with this, and they're not going to, because there's not a real incentive to. Now, the other thing that's totally screwed up about this is legacy admissions are still cool.
Okay, so define for us what a legacy admission is.
Legacy admission is you have rich parents that went to that school, so you automatically get in, regardless of grades or.
This is my daddy's alma mater, so I get to go to that school.
Right. Gentlemen's admissions are probably still cool too, right? Like Jared Kushner got into Harvard, and Trump liked to talk about that a lot, and Ivanka did too. But his teachers were like, I don't know how he got into Harvard. And then, of course, what the news reporters found out later on was, oh, yeah, his father gave Harvard $3 million the year before he started there. So I wonder how he got into Harvard. The price for admission.
I'm sure it was his test scores.
Yeah. Imagine how stupid you have to be for your dad to shovel out $3 million for them to let you in. That's got to be a slow kid. But yeah, no, I mean, we can go through this, but it is essentially going to push out, especially minority students. And then what ends up happening is, because you can't factor in race as much, it's going to change sort of how the awards programs go for some of these students, right? So can we factor in race when we give out scholarships as a college, right? Because that's going to be a big factor, because statistically, Hispanic, Latino, and Native American kids are poor, right? And as we've talked about many, many times, what's happened is we've paid less and less into public education, less and less every year. The Republicans cut it our whole lifetimes. And that's why college is so expensive. It's because it used to be the government paid for it, right? That's how the older generations went to school, the boomers and the Gen Xers. The government paid for most of their college. Now they're bitching about, well, why should we have to pay back your student loans? Because most of yours were prepaid. And now that you've created a system where you have to borrow all this money just to go to school, who gets pushed out first? The black kids, the Hispanic kids, the Native American kids, the Pacific Islander kids. Who are the ones that tend to go? Well, the kids who still have money. Tend to be white and Asian. So, I mean, that's just all screwed up. We can look at more. I mean, it's just, there's a lot to this whole thing. You mind if I do one little quick thing with this article here? So this was a Slate article. We'll just look at this last one real quick. So this is the Supreme Court just bulldozed affirmative action. So basically, Chief Justice Roberts' opinion of the court carves two loopholes. Schools can still consider how applicants discuss how the race affected his or her life in an essay. I just discussed that. And be treated based on those experiences. He also exempted the military academies from holding this altogether. That was the other second interesting point. How is it that the military is exempted from from banning affirmative action. The military can still use affirmative action, but universities can't.
So, what we're saying is that we want our minorities in certain places more than others. Is that maybe the message that's being delivered to us? Because it kind of seems like it.
Well, in what place do we want them versus where we don't? Want them in combat. We want them serving. We don't want them in college getting educated. I thought that was pretty creepy.
You know what? Our country has a history of that sort of thing, though. Let's think about it. Decades ago, what kinds of housing opportunities were being offered to people of color versus white folks? White folks were being offered,
redlining, yeah.
These different types of loans to be able to buy houses, and minorities were being offered the projects.
Yeah. And then
and it's all being disguised as being helpful, and here, this is the gift we're giving you, and how we're helping you out. When you stop and you look at it, all it really is it's some like creepy sort of tracking funneling system to funnel people into the place that decided they want them.
No, and then furthermore, the military system. I mean, when we did the drafts, the minorities got drafted first. And they got all the frontline assignments. If you want to look at it by percentage, we lost more black soldiers in Vietnam than we did white soldiers per capita. So you can't sit here and tell me that's. You can't tell me that there isn't some corruption there and there isn't some racism there. I'm not saying that's how it necessarily is today, but there is a design built in the system to do that, and this just exacerbates it. Right? I can't sit here and say Roberts is racist, but I can say is what he's doing is, or what they did, is going to absolutely hurt a lot of minorities, and especially poor people. So we'll move on from that, because that's the affirmative action. I mean, that's kind of a big blow, but we'll see how it all plays out. Now, the one we